Good afternoon from Europe and good morning to the United States, and welcome on behalf of the European Policy Center and the American-German Institute. I warmly welcome you all and thank you very much for joining this policy dialogue entitled Setting the Agenda Priorities for US-EU Relations under the Trump 2.0 administration. I am absolutely delighted that we are here together because there is a lot to talk about, a lot to chew on. It's been 2 weeks since the President of the United States has seen his inauguration, and it has been a whirlwind 2 weeks. And we as transatlantic thinkers coming together here, trying to understand what is, but also mapping out what should be, is a joint endeavor. And I'm very delighted to be doing this together with an excellent panel of speakers. Before I will introduce the speakers, I would just, under the impression of the tragic accident in Washington, a place that we all know, want to pause for a moment to commemorate those who have lost their lives in this tragic air accident. Thank you for that. Now, this is a really fantastic lineup. I'm happy that we have very, very good speakers today because there is a lot to chew on, a lot to understand, a lot to rewire in transatlantic discussions over trade and the economies that are so intertwined. And I'm welcoming here to the podium Francis Burwell, Distinguished Fellow at the Europe Center of the Atlantic Council. A very warm welcome to you. I welcome also Peter Rashish, who is the Vice President and Director of the Geoeconomics program at AGI, and of course, co-hosting this event with us. And actually, he was the one who also initiated it. So thank you for that idea, Peter. I also warmly welcome my colleague Georg Riekeles, who is Associate Director and Head of Europe's Political Economy program here at the European Policy Center, and someone who has been thinking a lot and plotting out concepts of economic security. Great to have you, Georg. And Elvire Fabry is joining us, a Senior Research Fellow at the Jacques Delors Institute, someone who has been following things Asian as much as things transatlantic, and that will be, of course, playing a role here as well. Thank you very much for being here, Elvire. And before we go into this discussion, and I will give the floor to our speakers for some initial kickoffs, I'm very happy that we are going to be welcomed by our co-hosts today. And please, Jeff Rathke, President of the American-German Institute at Johns Hopkins University. It's great to have you, and please take the floor.
Well, thank you, Almut. It's a real pleasure to be with you today, and a great privilege for us to co-organize this event with the European Policy Center. And we've had such a long and productive relationship that it's really gratifying to be able to apply that relationship and our expertise collectively to the big issues that are in front of us. I know our viewers will want to hear what our experts have to say, so I'm only going to make one or two observations. First, we are in a second Trump administration, which has some echoes of the first one, but we also see it taking office and acting with more speed than we experienced the last time around, and we see this in ways that are going to reshape a number of international aspects. If you look at the massive retaliation that the Trump administration threatened 1 week ago against Colombia because of a migration and a deportation issue, which also would have had severe trade effects, that is one data point. If you look at the horizontal linkages that the Trump administration has applied to the relationship with Canada and Mexico, and people will be aware that there is a deadline the Trump administration placed February 1st, in other words, tomorrow, for certain accommodations that, and if not met, could have enormous trade implications of a 25% tariff on both countries. We couple that with the repeated demand from the Trump administration toward Denmark and toward Greenland, and the potential for that to take on a really dramatic effect on U.S. relations with a European Union member state and potentially with the European Union as a whole. We see what is at stake and how large these issues are. So trade, technology, investment, in the context of strengthened international competition, this sets the stage for the discussion we're going to have today. And with that, I'm really pleased to hand the microphone back to you, Almut, and to hear the perspectives that this great panel is going to bring to our discussion today. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And the way we're going to do this is I'm going to ask each speaker to give a 5-minute mapping of, what keeps him or her really busy thinking in this, as Jeff was describing, very fast-paced environment, and one that from a European perspective has some things that are recognizable, but also some profound changes. And my understanding is, and we will hear that from our European colleagues in their understanding, that of course Europe is facing an environment that is not as benign as it has been. Needless to say, competition is part of international cooperation and of alliances, but this is a different era. So having said that, I would like to turn to the other side of the Atlantic first and go to Francis Burwell and ask you, Fran, having looked at the first days of the Trump administration kicking off and sort of what you anticipated was gonna happen, how do you map what has happened over the first days? And what do you sense sort of in this, what is being said and what is being actually acted upon? What are the things that we should be absolutely looking at? What are the things that are probably less relevant in terms of policy, even though they're very loud? What are the things that matter from your point of view, Fran?
Let me start. First off, thank you very much for including me in this discussion. It's a great set of other panelists, so very glad to be here. Let me start first about talking about transitions in general, because I think there are some things that happen in transitions that always cause issues with our allies, but that are not specific to this transition. I just came back from Brussels, and there was quite a bit of frustration at the difficulty of reaching out, of finding the right people to talk to, and the lack of people in positions or even knowing who might be in positions. Unfortunately, this is kind of the norm with US transitions. And I think we have only to recall when President Obama came into office in the middle of the financial crisis, it was quite a few months before there were people at Treasury that could respond to European queries. So the other thing is that transitions are often erratic for about 6 months. Different people say different things. They're not used to being in government. They cause a lot of confusion by not checking their statements and hewing to the administration's line. So you see a lot of differences between different officials, and we are seeing that. The difference, the closeness, for example, of President Trump to some of the large tech companies, and yet his vice president voicing concerns about these companies. The other thing is that administrations come in, and if they haven't been in power, they believe the world has not changed. And that's particularly true of the European Union. So they come in and they expect to see the European Union of 2020. And we all know how much the EU has changed since then. This is, however, also a very different transition from the first Trump transition coming in from the Obama years. It's far more organized. They had clearly been thinking about what their priorities would be. There has been a lot of reshuffling of expectations of personnel and people appointed that people were not thinking would be appointed. So there's some issues with that, but I would say overall, this transition is being led by someone who believes he is right. In fact, the assassination attempt, I think, has had a real impact in convincing him he is even more right, and who is not waiting for the establishment figures that he had in his first administration to tell him what is right or wrong or what he should be doing. He's just going forward. priorities, thus, in Washington are the priorities you hear from Donald Trump. The first one is the domestic economy, and especially creating jobs through manufacturing while unfettering companies from regulation. The second priority, and some days it's very hard to judge which is one and which is priority two, is the border. And this has to do not only with people, but with fentanyl, but generally the fact or the belief that our border is unsafe and it is threatening the health of the United States. This is the economic view is a very mercantilist view of the world. It is competition between nations to attract manufacturing and grow companies. So Europeans who were concerned even under the Biden administration that the United States was launching an effort to attract European companies to move their manufacturing to the United States, double that concern, because it will be there will be a punitive element. Not just the Biden administration had brought in incentives for that. This administration will threaten penalties if you don't do that. It is very much, I would say, a reversion to the 1930s and potentially even before. There is no concept that lowering barriers can lead to prosperity. Instead, think of the world as a zero-sum game. Borders also become critical to national security. Territory is all important. I thought it was really revealing that the president spoke about manifest destiny in his inaugural speech, even though it was about space. We have seen several articles in Washington about his desire to promote William McKinley as a very influential US president. McKinley was the one who brought Hawaii into being a US territory. Borders keep bad things out and make your people safe. At the extreme, when you put the economics and the borders together, this is a very autarkic view of the world, although not in terms of stopping communication or anything like that. But the US must be self-sufficient.
I am not sure we can hear Francis Burwell.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Excellent. Thank you very much.
So
yes.
There's also a belief in linking economics and other issues. So thus you see tariffs that have to do with the threat of tariffs, which have to do with whether Mexico is putting appropriate restrictions on the border. And I think there's a huge amount of faith in leverage. So many of these threats are threats, and they may or may not be carried out. The Colombia incident that Jeff referred to, I think, has only reinforced the reinforced the success of this approach in the president's mind. I think it's an open question whether we will see tariffs tomorrow on Mexico and Canada and possibly China. But what I found interesting is that he's not mentioned Europe. So although Europe has occasionally come up for criticism, I think Europe is not a priority. Europe is a secondary priority, and there is no compunction to interact with Europe just because you're allies and partners. Europe does have the second largest trade deficit with the United States after China, especially when you look at trade in goods. And one would think that this would make the president more prone to lashing out at Europe. However, I think that because it is the border that is almost as much a priority as the economics, Europe does not play into that, with the exception of Greenland. And I think all of us were kind of shocked by the return to this idea of Greenland. But when you think about how 8 years ago, there was not so much of an emphasis on critical minerals, this makes a great deal of sense Furthermore, we are now looking at greater competition in the north. And so therefore, some kind of control over Greenland makes sense if you think of the president's worldview. So what do I see for Europe? Let me finish with that. The watchword, I think, is uncertainty. We will probably see a long period of threats of tariffs, but probably not implementation, unless the Greenland thing spins out of control. The tariff threats will be used as leverage. And you should remember that once you impose tariffs, you lose some of the leverage. We will see, I think some of the other uncertainties are the influence of the tech companies who have, in some cases, been very critical of European regulation. And we will see this administration support companies much more than the Biden administration did. And so we're likely to see a lot more criticism of Europe from that point of view. But I think one of the challenges Europe is going to face is actually getting the attention that it wants from this administration. However, on the other hand, given the type of attention that this administration provides to countries of concern, maybe that's not such a bad thing. And I'll stop with that.
Well, thank you very much, Fran, for kicking this off. And I will go to Peter now. As someone who is studying also, the events unfolding in the United States, but through the lens of understanding Europe as well, what is it that you feel, in addition to Francis Burwell's points, or perhaps in overlap, what do we need to understand? What are the things to really sort of focus on and dig deeper into? What are the things to ignore? What is essential? What matters at this point in time as the current US administration is setting off and is starting to implement policies? Peter, what is your take?
Thanks, Almut. Well, it's going to be a little hard to know before tomorrow when the administration will reveal whether there'll be tariffs on Canada and Mexico, as well as before April 1st, when the multi-agency review of what the White House is calling the America First trade policy will come in. But that said, let me try to discern at least three things that I think are priorities. And the first thing I think is deconstructing the global economic order. I think the Trump administration thinks that in many cases, at least, if it can increase the quantity of disorder in the global economy, this can actually help the United States because it creates more freedom of action for it as a geoeconomic actor versus the more traditional approach, which even to a certain degree characterized his first administration, which is building alliances because they create some added effectiveness as a way of balancing a sort of sovereignty approach to achieve national interests. I think this has been a constant in Trump's kind of, view of the world, that the rules-based trading system, is stacked against the US, even though it was a US creation. And then the second thing, which has also been a leitmotif of Trump, is eliminating the trade deficit. He sees trade, unlike 99% of economists, I would say, he sees trade deficits as inherently negative for the economy. And he believes also that trade policy tools can be a way to remedy that, as opposed to macroeconomic policy tools. If you look in this America First trade policy memo, it even goes as far as framing trade deficits as an economic security and a national security threat. And related to the trade deficit issue is the idea that the US should try to repatriate manufacturing, and have foreign producers also, and incentivize foreign producers to come and produce in the United States, which it may do through the use of tariffs. So they will then want to get behind that tariff wall and move their production to the United States. I have to say, that the economic, taken to, it depends how far the administration wants to go, but taken maybe not to the extreme, but taken, 50 yards down the football field, the economic logic is a bit questionable because there's, whatever you think of trade deficits, it's also, it's good to be an importer, it's good to be an exporter, but if you want to be an exporter, you need people to import. So at some point, unless the administration really does think that autarky is the way to achieve U.S. prosperity, it needs to think a little bit about the ultimate consequences of this idea of trying to incentivize production in the United States, because then in the long run, you impoverish your trading partners, and there's going to be no one to buy your products. The third thing that I would mention, although I'm actually a little cautious about it, is China competition. The reason I'm cautious is it really hasn't been emphasized as much as I think we all probably would have expected. I mean, there is talk in this memo about industrial supply chains and circumvention through third countries, and an estimate. He wants an estimate of the costs imposed by China's unfair trade practices. But that's something that is pretty much a bipartisan concern. There is a mention of the possible revocation of what the U.S. calls permanent normal trade relations and what pretty much everybody else calls most favored nation status in the WTO, which would give the U.S. a little more liberty to do whatever it wants on tariffs on China. On two other things, though, it's interesting that there is an openness to free trade agreements, although the emphasis is on market access for the United States. And again, traditionally, the way trade negotiations work is you trade things off, and so there would have to be some market access for whatever trading partner you're talking to. But that is there. And then the last thing I would say is that there's no mention of the European Union or the World Trade Organization. If I wanted to take a glass half full approach, and we're only a couple of weeks into the administration, so why not? That may mean that, as Fran said, it may mean that they don't see Europe as kind of a hot button kind of place for their most key concerns, say migration. But it could also be that for the moment, at least, the Trump administration doesn't want to imperil doing some deals with the EU, for example, on LNG purposes. And on the WTO, I think it could mean they're just indifferent, and they don't really see it as a constraint on its policy making, maybe just taking it to another level from the Biden administration, which I think was certainly not hostile to the WTO, but I never got the impression that it believed that the WTO was in any way constraining its trade policy making. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Peter. Let me bring this now to our European colleagues and start with Georg. Obviously, the European Commission has sailed off with a new mandate. There is, of course, ambition to still uphold that the Union wants to be relevant in the world. And listening to what US colleagues are sort of describing as priorities, concerns, emerging policies, Georg, just bring in sort of from a European perspective, the level of preparedness, the level of expectations. What are you hearing in the conversations in Brussels and with regard to member states? Because it feels like there is a sense of preparedness for a lot more antagonism to be playing out. So how prepared is Europe? And then, of course, also something we want to get to in this conversation, what are actually European priorities, and where could we find perhaps also surprising overlap that might not be meeting the eye immediately? Georg.
Thank you, Almut, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss with all of you, and a pleasure to listen to Jeff and Francis and Peter and their excellent analysis. So, yeah, you ask, well, how does one deal with the antagonism? And there's, I think the first comment is perhaps there is more antagonism than one actually expected. I think everybody knew that we were, in a sense, whether we wanted or not, all having to board this chaos train that Trump represents. But I do think that there are some things that have been significantly more brutal than what was expected in European capitals, in Brussels, and across the world. Peter spoke about the deconstruction of the global economic order. I think it's not only the economic order. What we're talking about here is a deconstruction, attempted deconstruction, at least in words, of the global order tout court. And I think what Europe is facing now, a moment where you have, on the one hand, China and Russia, that both are revisionist in terms of the international order, and the US that has become a revolutionary power when it comes to the international order. And that is, of course, a very dramatic backdrop. I think it is a very dramatic event, a tipping point potentially for what the West can stand for and do together, because I think the West is essentially a norm-based concept. And what has been holding us together are common norms, fundamental norms. And this is what is under quite significant attack now. So you ask for what are the priority issues for the EUs? Well, I'll sort of mention 4 or 5 of them, and I think none of them will really surprise you. I think the first one is really to continue to stand up, to fight, to be a standard bearer for rule-based order and international institutions. I think this is not at all a lonely battle. One shouldn't lure oneself into this thought that this is going to be or is a lonely battle. I think there are many, many other countries, lots of friends around the world who still believe in something that is rule-based and orderly. And of course, we shouldn't forget that 50% of Americans, or perhaps many more, also still believe that. So I think it's important as Europeans also to think that it's, as the US withdraws from international institutions and withdraws from these common norms, it's important that Europeans think that we cannot also only let China to take over. Staying on the sort of the theme of values, I think there are some very fundamental values that must be the EU priorities right now in terms of keeping up the fundamentals of liberal democracy. Fran touched upon that. I think tech and the role that tech is playing and will play now going forward is absolutely critical. And I think in this context, we have entered through tech, through the increasing algorithmification of our society, of the economy, of our institutions, of politics, into a moment of fundamental threats to liberal democracy. And there's sort of a pincer attack here from both East and West. And West, of course, it is about accountability, let's say it, of the big tech platforms and algorithms. That this lack of accountability that we've seen for years, and we've been too slow to do something with, is now being supercharged by Zuckerberg's venality and Musk's super spreading of lies and disinfo. And I think on the surface, this is a deep structural transformation of our public space that will render progressively democracy more and more difficult to exercise. And as it happens, I think the project now, both of Putin and Musk, is to make our public spaces a place where everything is possible and nothing is true. But our societies, our democracies will not function if that's the case. So this is another major priority, I think, for Europe to stand up to and deal with. Climate agenda, of course, sustainability agenda. Of course, there are major trade-offs with economic security, competitiveness, etc. But I don't think that Europeans, despite the fact it will be difficult, will give that up. A fourth point I would say is open economies. Avoid a tit-for-tat trade war, which will be hugely destructive. Of course, one might get drawn into it. Trade war, tax war. Something that might merge into a currency war. So this is going to be very, very challenging, but I think it is priority of Europeans to try to avoid this while being ready to respond. And my fifth point in this context, in terms of priorities, I think Europeans are much less naive now than they were a couple of years back. We do see that the international environment has changed. There are many things to talk about there, of course, but you could start with China. China has massive overcapacity, weaponized trade dependencies. China as the decisive enabler of Russia's war of aggression, as the NATO summit declaration in Washington said. Europeans see that. And I think that also is what opens up a space for cooperation with the new American administration. I'm not sure it will happen. I'm not sure it will be possible, But I think there are, as Fran and Peter pointed to, also possibilities, for instance, for a series of economic security deals, if one wanted to go there. But I think our friends in America and the French and those who want to listen to us in the US administration need to know that if it's about an all-out attack, horizontal linkages that we've seen, the use of tech, the weaponization of the security situation, etc., those kind of cooperative agendas will be absolutely impossible. It'll be politically impossible, and will lack a bandwidth for this. So how should the EU react and go forward now? I think back a lot to 2016, where at the EU level we had both Brexit and Trump, and I think some of the lessons, even though the situation is much more dire now, some of the lessons still apply. Be prepared, stay focused, don't be provoked, don't get drawn into the circus. Ignore the provocations. Tim Snyder was saying, don't obey in advance. I think Europeans have really shown already that that's their intention. There's been sort of this wall of silence on Greenland, a kind of wall of silence on what Musk has been doing, what one hasn't what can I say, upped the game. But I think the preparation is taking place. And I think in parallel to this, what is important is that Europeans have this capacity of offering a clear vision of a future that Europeans can believe in. So I think Europeans are relatively well prepared. There's an Excel sheet over at the Commission, I would say, with a number of tools to be able to use. But of course, the critical test is unity. When I was a kid, there was this rap song by Queen Latifah, UNYTY, which was about unity. And I think that is going to be really the test for Europeans now, against also attempts of divide and rule. One need to be able to play Team Europe. One should not accept that if interlocutors from Washington attempts are for that to be Meloni or Orban or Fizzo, there's a constitutional order in terms of who has competences in trade, in ag, and so on and so forth. So that is what we have to play. This is not going to be easy. And I think, like was pointed out by other colleagues here also, there is a real risk that Europe's lack of agency, for instance, in security, will translate into lack of agency in the economic sphere. So it is a deeply challenging context. But overall, I think in this age of cynics, of the corrupt, too many Europeans are also being pessimistic about this and have lost faith in this continent's own agency. And I think it's really important that we collectively talk up Europe's agency in this and try to figure out the way that to act together rather than sort of being drawn in and succumb to the gloom or to the chaos that is surrounding us. So that's how I would see the situation to start off for Europeans.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Georg. And we share, I think, an early teenage years memory there. But fundamentally, I mean, you were fundamental, and this is about fundamentals. And needless to say, the security situation, Russia's war against Ukraine, and the acute vulnerability that Europeans are feeling at this point in time is also setting off dynamics. And there's a link here to the trade angle and concern that the Trump administration will sort of leverage via that. And that is something acutely dangerous, in my opinion. But let's turn now to Elvire and hear from you, Elvire, whether you share the sort of the perspective that Georg has been mapping out, perhaps also with a bit of a deeper dive into something Georg touched upon, and that is the sort of EU member state dynamic. Needless to say, from the White House point of view, I mean, the Union as such, the European Union, doesn't seem to matter. There are different logics applied to what creates relevance, I believe, in international relations. And the element of member states, of course, is a very important one. Elvire, if you were to look with your experience at these challenges that the Europeans are facing, do you share Georg's take that it's very fundamental and it's really high time for Europe to wake up to that? Or where do you place yourself in sort of the analysis, Elvire?
Thank you very much, Almut. Well, I think straight away I would say that I would be tempted to raise the level of urgency and to wake up call among the 27. let me start by, in a way, by the big picture. I completely agree with the assessment that Peter made, and then Georg went back to it about the big scope that Donald Trump is taking compared to Trump 1. We see that announcing universal tariffs, announcing that he wants to reorder globalization. We see that this is, I mean, the whole world will be concerned, and it's not only Colombia over migration issues. Is that the Trump's initiatives can have a huge impact globally, and it's not only about rebalancing some trade deficits. It's rather about even having some more impact, more structural impact on the macroeconomics of some big trade partners. Let me start first by his views on China, because this is the sequencing of the announcements are very interesting, and then I'll go back to Europe and to the divisions between the potential division between the member states, because it's interesting for us to see what we can anticipate. We have a lot of unknowns concerning the implementation, but the direction are quite clear at the moment. It was, of course, interesting to see that Trump started to target the closest allies and closest integrated partner, Canada and Mexico. But it has already a huge impact for others, because that was closing. I mean, if he was to impose some tariffs on Mexico and Canada, whatever the purpose, it would close the back door of to access the U.S. market, and this would have an impact not only for Europeans, but of course for Chinese. And the fact that China hasn't been targeted until now, we'll see tomorrow if there's a 10% tariff, but 10% is not huge compared to what he was announced with the 60%. So what we see for the moment is a big ambition concerning globalization. China was supposed to be the priority, and we'll see if there's room for only for small negotiation on deals to reduce the trade deficit. That would be the trend supported by the new USTR. But there's also more appetite for stronger pressure on China to change its economic policy, to increase the support to demand, to change its currency policy, and that could imply much more harder pressure on China. Overall, what it means is that it is quite surprising that until now the Europeans have not been targeted directly. I'm not sure it is reassuring, because in a way we could consider that the EU is not considered by Trump as a big challenge, and that it will be able to be pressured as much as it wants, and as it has signaled with the Greenland issue. But the way it will deal with Xi Jinping will have a huge impact on the EU. Depending if, I mean, the big risk that we should really consider is that he won't only impose some tariffs on Xi Jinping that would have an impact in terms of trade diversion and increasing pressure from China to access the European market, but that there's also some possibility to have a deal between Washington and Beijing, which would bypass European, or would be at least would ignore the European interest, and which could have a strong impact on the EU. So going back to how the Europeans are perceiving the threats that could be imposed by Trump, I think we have to distinguish what we see first as with this big unknown concerning the US and China relation, and the impact that it could have on the EU. Second, the competitiveness shock that domestic measures taken that will be adopted by Trump will have on the EU, because with the deregulation, with the tax cuts, we see that we are facing a big competitiveness shock. And this is, I think this is the, at least for the moment, it's the, what is the more interesting in the European side is to see that the focus of the Europeans are really on that competitiveness challenge. We haven't heard a lot of discussions on the way we're going to address bilateral aggressive measures, but we anticipate that there will be a competitiveness shock that will be important, and at least for the moment we see that maybe because we have this competitiveness compact that has been put on the table, maybe because we hear that on the side of Germany with the probably the election of Merz at the Chancellery, we hear that he could be supporting, he could be very supportive of an industrial policy and maybe some reforms of the debt brake, which could be very positive for a big push in terms of European industrial policy and investment capacity. We see that there's some opportunities for a boost for integration of the single market. That's a positive element. But if we consider the U-turn of the US on the climate change issues, this could burden the EU very importantly, because the EU will be burdened with the need to promote the climate challenge on its own, and maybe also with a closer coordination with China. So that will be an issue for the Europeans to agree on the way they want to coordinate and cooperate with China on those climate issues. And this will also raise some division could raise some division between the member states in the way we would be tempted to delay the implementations of some green regulations in the EU. That was already suggested in the European Compass, and also by the launch of the strategic dialogue on the automotive industry. Some regulation, some targeted could be delayed, and this could be seen as a pragmatic option to avoid some exemptions for US companies. So it could be interesting also to reduce the cost for companies of those green measures, and to allow to face the competitiveness shock of the US. But concerning the digital regulations, which will be targeted by Trump, it will be more challenging for the EU and for the 27 to agree to respond with some a unified position to push back, while this is really concerning the core of the collective preferences of the Europeans. And I think I would be less optimistic than Georg about the unity of the 27. We see that the European Commission, at least at the DigiTrade, they have been preparing the responses, and they would be prepared to use some tariffs, some defensive tools. I'm not sure we have that unity between the 27. I'm not sure that. I mean, there's a very cautious approach, not to avoid that tit for tat scenario that Georg just suggested. But do we have the unity also to eventually stand up and back up some the use of some defensive tools that would be most needed also to defend, to avoid to have some coercive pressure to deregulate or to postpone the implementation of some regulations. I think there's a really a challenging issue for the 27.
Well, thank you very much, Elvire. There was also a lot in there, and you already started, and that's great to respond to one of the questions that was put. Thank you very much, Klaus Prömpers, and this is the way for everyone who is here in this session. Please make yourselves heard through the Q&A, and the first one that Elvire Fabry started to respond to, I will just read it out for everyone, put by Klaus Prömpers, saying, having seen the pilgrimage of right-wing governments to inauguration and before as well, after seems to indicate there will be no unified answer of EU and trade attacks we will have to expect. So, do you see a single point which might bring unity to 27 members, especially, and here's what Elvire started to talk about, when we discuss the sustainability of the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act? And here, let me bring this quickly back to Georg before I then go to Francis Burwell and Peter Rashish for US perspectives. Because Georg, you also were very fundamental in mapping out, well, our lens should really not be about mere sort of policy convergence or lack thereof, but should be really about the fundamentals of liberal democracy. And do we really apply the right lens at this point in time is then perhaps the question when we're looking at transatlantic economic ties as well. But if you were to sort of respond to Klaus Prömpers and say, you know, where would unity be achieved, and what kind of modes and processes could the Commission use to actually get there?
Yes, thank you for that question from Klaus Prömpers, and also it's an opportunity to respond a little bit to Elvire. I guess we want to debate amongst ourselves, and maybe my response there is to say, I mean, I'm far from optimistic, Elvire, and I think these are deeply challenging issues, and I think the construct we have in the EU as a whole, but EU member states and European countries are facing the most difficult situation they are faced, but we have faced since the end of the Second World War. So there's no sense of optimism or attempt at sort of brushing the difficulties under the carpet. What I was trying to say is, I think it's very important that we avoid a victimhood approach, that we avoid overcorrecting towards the defensive. And I think it's very important that we give up our agency ex ante. And I think that is very much at the heart of question of Klaus, also when it relates to the DSA, DMA. I said that the Commission so far, and the signals, and there have been some press reports about sort of not pushing too ambitiously on the implementation of DMA and DSA. I think if that is the case, that is a fundamental error. And I think bullies, they go after and they prey on the weak, whereas what they respect is only some form of strength and a capacity to answer. So I think it's absolutely an important question for the Commission and an urgent agenda to make sure that we are ready to use to the fullest the tools we have under DSA, under DMA, GDPR, and so on and so forth. And I really hope that is the Commission agenda going forward. I think these tools that we have, and also in the competition field, it's not only about the DMA, there's direct treaty powers. This is not something where for a certain number of the steps, the sanctions defines, where the Commission has to go and beg the member states for the capacity to act, or has to rely on unanimity decision. So I think part of the answer is yes, that we need a very courageous Commission in this part, in this game going forward. And I think one of the sort of elements of the what can I say, the silver linings in this current moment is that I think we do have relative strength in the EU institutions, in the person of Ursula von der Leyen. I'm not sure she will have an easy dialogue with Washington, but she knows the machine, and she's shown herself as being a capable leader of the Commission. I think Costas is also a very capable leader in the European Council, in the European Parliament, Metsola similarly. So that's already one part of the answer. Then I do hope that in the context of the trade war that I don't think we'll be avoiding, I think we'll be getting it full force. I think and hope that this can actually participate in rallying the center. So when Germany is seeing its mechanical industry, its car industry, its chemicals industry potentially targeted, well, I think there, and I hope there will be an understanding in Berlin that one needs to play this collectively with other Europeans. And I do still have some hope that the thinking in Rome can still be the same. And I do think also, with some exceptions, that across Europe, across the 27, a number of capitals in Eastern and Central Europe, they will also see a bigger picture here, even in countries where you have conservative governments, to see that their brand of conservatism is not necessarily the same as what we currently have in Washington. And the last point that I think is important here also is to think sort of beyond the immediate actions and reactions. Realities have their own weight. Economic realities will have their own weight. And I think we've already started seeing this, that the decisions that Trump takes in the US have consequences and create counter reactions. And in the same thing, we will see in the trade field. A trade war does not come for free in terms of, for instance, cost on inflation, in terms of effects on the dollar, and so on and so forth. So this is also a necessity for Europeans to be able to see the longer game and also to let Trump face the consequences of what he is doing. So I think we still, and I think it's the only thing one can hope for, is that if Europeans are willing to stand together, that we can have better outcomes and solutions than if we start breaking the unity. But of course, I have under no illusion, this will be extremely difficult week in and week out.
Thank you very much, Georg. You also responded to a question put by Philip Hamrodrotz that was going into the direction of by what actions would the EU try to convince that Europeans actually must act together. So a strong Commission certainly is one major pillar for that. I will bring it now back to Francis Burwell and then also to Peter, because we cover a lot of ground, and this is really a lot, and you will probably also want to comment. I see that questions are coming in, and that's great. I will start to weave them into the conversation, but then we will also have a proper Q&A. So please keep those questions coming. And I would like to bring it back to Fran. Please feel free to comment on what was said previously. But also we want to cover a bit more ground with regard to the questions, but at the next step. Francis.
So I largely agree with Georg that tariffs themselves can be a unifying action. And I think that what we're seeing almost as a preparation for this is the Greenland scenario. And I was quite struck when I was in Brussels, which of course is not the mirror of all the diverse member states. But I was struck that almost the extreme nature of this threat has made people much more ready to start thinking about what the reactions will be. I would point out that I think that it's not necessarily because of the trade deficit that we will see tariffs. I think we will have some complications. One of the areas that the administration is clearly starting to step up on is digital service taxes. Peter is right. Europe was not mentioned in the America First trade policy, but we've seen some in that policy and also in some other executive orders mentions of DSTs, and a real feeling emerging that this is something that should be fought against by Washington, that it is illegitimate. As you all know, Washington has walked away from the OECD tax negotiations. And so that is another possibility of where we will see tariffs applied. We may also see tariffs applied because of fines on the tech companies under DSA and DMA. These are being described as another form of tax. And so I think Europe is going to have to be prepared for tariffs to come or threats of tariffs to come for reasons that one might not necessarily have thought would lead to tariffs. I don't sense that, I mean, we now have two types of companies in Washington or emerging in Washington. One are the companies that some time ago decided that they're going to comply with DSA and DMA. The European market is a huge thing for US companies. Sometimes, in some cases, it's even more profitable than the United States market. And these companies want to be good players and responsible players. But we have seen others, and I would point to Meta here in particular, with Zuckerberg removing the third-party content moderation, who are attempting to roll back because they believe they will now have more support from the US government to do that. And so I think Europe is going to have to distinguish between companies very sharply, and we will have to see what happens. On the question of unity, I thought I would just give a little pep talk because as an American who has followed the EU for years, Europe is fairly unified. The Europe that responded to Ukraine, that responded to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that responded to COVID. Sure, there were issues at the beginning, but what I am seeing is a Europe that is far more advanced than I would have imagined in 2020. And one of the worst things that happens is Europeans who come over to Washington and say, we will never be unified. We are not unified. We cannot get our act together. That is a sign of weakness. And one of the problems with the Trump administration in terms of transatlantic relations is that they believe that Europe is weak. They look at growth rates of 1%, maybe. They look at the political dysfunction that we're seeing in France and Germany right now. And I think that, there is a case for that, for saying that Europe is weak. On the other hand, it puts the emphasis right on the competitiveness agenda. There's a huge question in my mind about whether the competitiveness agenda will work, but I cannot emphasize the importance of stimulating Europe's economy, because that's the only way that Europe becomes a serious negotiating interlocutor. I won't say partner, interlocutor for the Trump administration. If you want to be respected by the Trump administration, you have to have the economic strength and the desire to represent your own interests. So Trump expects countries and other negotiators to put forward their own interests. He doesn't expect them to say, what would you like? He wants them to say what their interests are. So I would underscore not only the reality of unity in the EU, but also talking about unity and also talking about competitiveness. This is an agenda that in order to deal with the Trump administration, Europe must deal with its competitiveness agenda.
Thank you, Fran. And we've seen that, at least in the wording also evolving of Commission President von der Leyen, that the competitiveness piece, of course, also internally in Europe is playing a much stronger role these days. Let me just bring this to Peter and see, what you are going to pick up of this rich menu, and add a question that I see here in the chat that is more on the sort of US basket, I believe. How do you create reliable a reliable organizational structure like the TDC or TEC between an action-driven transactional executive US administration and a consensus-driven process-oriented EU with its institutions? Is this even feasible? Asked Jan van Haaf, and thank you for that question, Peter.
First, I agree with both Georg and Fran about the importance of the European Union strengthening itself. You know, it needs to respect itself, and then Trump will respect it. I think that there is a very strong chance, if particularly France and Germany allow it, that we'll have another burst of dynamism like we had under the Delors Commission, that we'll need to have a kind of grand bargain where Germany gives up on the capital market side to have a union, and France gives up on the defense side to have a union. But I think if those two countries especially allow it, I can be optimistic about the EU. But I don't think that's enough. And I think the reason I say that, there is a strategic economic context. Elvire mentioned climate. It was a very interesting way she framed it. She said, well, is the EU going to end up cooperating more with China on climate than the United States because of the behavior of the Trump administration? And I think that points to an issue with the Trump administration, but I think it points to an issue that you would have had with the Harris administration, that it's going to get more acute as we get further along in the decade. And that is that what I see is the inevitable tension between the multilateralism and actually getting things done on incredibly urgent issues like climate. I think at some point, I think the Biden administration was sort of already there, and the Trump administration doesn't care about climate, but at some point the EU is going to have to decide, what's more important, fixing the climate emergency or adhering to multilateral trade rules? You know, maybe the Indians will do the EU a favor and they will bring a complaint against the carbon border adjustment. I'm saying this facetiously, but maybe they'll bring a complaint against the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and the dispute panel in the WTO will find that it's not in conformity with WTO rules, and then the EU will realize, you know, we did this great thing, it's that for the climate, but it's not working out with the multilateral trade system. So whoever is the president of the United States now and in the future, I think you're going to face this problem in the United States. And to me, the idea of the EU choosing to cooperate with China, which is an adversary, over the United States, who's still a NATO ally, you know, just because in the first case you may be able to technically, legally be in conformity with WTO rules, while in the second you can't. I personally think that'd be a big mistake.
Thank you, Peter. I am just looking at the many questions that we're getting here, and I'm trying to work through them. But if I can't work through all of them, please forgive me, because it is really a big number. I start here with another batch of questions that is addressed towards the Europeans. And here is Alex Privitera asking, how worried are you about a misalignment in terms of speed? That means the Trump administration breaks old structures and the EU responds with legislative measures that take time to materialize, especially given the ingrained reluctance by member states to act big and instead converge towards small common denominators. Take implementation of the new Commission's agenda. This is a question that is directed at the sort of the sheer pace and that it need to be speedy, and the Union of 27 is simply in a mode of a different kind in that context. I'm just looking at Elvire to come in first on this one, and that was Alex Privitera. Thank you very much, Alex, for that question.
Yeah, this is a key question, and it's a challenge that we already had 2 years ago when the IRA was implemented. The EU had to respond with a very quick answer to avoid that the attractiveness of these measures would be an incentive for European firms to go to the US, to invest in the US, and the announcements that were made for the US economy will have a very quick impact. If we talk about at first for 2025, preserving tax cuts, preserving the current level of tax, and then decreasing them maybe ahead even of 2026. This will have an impact also with a progressive deregulation. That's why I think all the agenda concerning the integration of the single market is really an urgent one, and we see that we're facing a lot of complex issues when we talk about the capital market union, which has been on the table for the past 10 years. It's not going to be fixed in one day, but there's a lot of things that can be done in terms of deregulation, I mean, simplification of regulations, as it has to be, as it has to be called, on the investment side, agreeing on some, I mean, maybe for the moment the proposals that were made by the European Commission, which are redirecting some fiscal capacity and some investment capacity, are going into the right direction. But we will have to go back again to some common, I mean, the need to increase some common capacity, some common investment capacity, and even if we see that MERS is not remains quite opposed to the idea of some Eurobonds or some common debt at the European level, but I think that we see already that there's some shift on the European side on those issues, and that even if it came quite late, the recent joint declaration between Macron and Scholz about industrial policy, investment capacity, and notably in the defense industry sector, is going in the right direction. The Europeans are going to face in the very short term, some tests, not only I mean, first of all, with Greenland. I think it's important, even if it shouldn't be considered only as an issue about respecting international laws. Greenland is an economic asset, is because it's a reserve of critical minerals, because it has some. I mean, it is an economic asset, and as such, we should hear the 27 as a common actor. Taking a stance on Greenland and defending Denmark. But we will see also that in the short term, the ratification of Mercosur will be important, because if we get to have a unity, I mean, if not a unity, but at least a ratification capacity to agree on this agreement and to implement it, this is also a strong signal that the EU would send to the US and to the rest of the world, and this is positioning the EU in a very different situation than if it was to renounce to that agreement. So I think there's some structural reforms that have to be done. It will take some time, but there's also some in the short term, some important signals that we can be sent.
Thank you, Elvire. This is a truly transatlantic debate because the questions are really coming from all corners to all sides. And I'm staying for a second with the European side, where we have another question regarding von der Leyen's mission right now. Robert Becker asking, and Georg, I want to put that to you. Von der Leyen has just announced a goal of greater deregulation and looser trade policies. Can she pull these policies off? What is the likely reaction of the member states? Do you have a comment on that? And is that your interpretation? Go ahead.
Thank you, Almut. Yes, happy to say a few words about that. The first I wanted to say, I really appreciate. I love the way Fran always gives us a pep talk as Europeans. I mean, I would go on a panel with Fran every week, every day, if I could, just to hear that pep talk, because I think it's really important and we need it. And Peter said the same, by the way. I wrote myself a piece a week or two ago, which I called Straighten Up Europe. And I think this is critical. You can't go to Washington, or you can't speak amongst Europeans thinking you're beaten or that you don't have any agency anymore. And it's not true. If we want, that future is still ahead of us. And the capacity to act is there. And we have spent far too much time talking or hanging around pessimists that think that nothing can be done and we can't act anymore. And that's why we need the Frans and the Peters and the Elvire and others in this world that say, okay, but look at the possibilities of action. And I think One element there is absolutely what this question points to. And there's a question also of speed that you raised to Elvire. Yes, there is urgency of action now when it comes to competitiveness. I think a number of commissioners, prime ministers, the president von der Leyen went to Davos and really heard that message and came back with a really heightened sense of urgency. And I think that is sort of the intention now going forward in the Commission, in really, whether it's through simplification, this omnibus proposal that's coming, clean industrial deal, pushing very hard on trade policy. We've seen some early signs of that already, Mercosur and Mexico and so forth, to really go down that route. And I think to actually member states understand this. I heard there was a meeting in Berlin not that many days ago amongst the conservative prime ministers, and really that was the focus. And the focus was, what can we do more and how can we do it more quickly? So also in terms of speed, I think there are a certain number of things that can be done. One of the things that we've proposed, for instance, is to say, if you were just to raise the SME threshold in Europe from the current numbers 250 to 500, that's an instant competitiveness shock, because that means that all sort of the exceptions, alleviations that you have in the single market that apply to SMEs suddenly will apply to many more businesses. So there are tools there if there's the willingness to use them. So I'm not so worried about the capacity to act on competitiveness. I'm not so worried either about the capacity to act with speed when it comes to, what can you say, the sanctions side of things, or responding with autonomous trade measures, because these tools are relatively well put together. And we've shown the sanctions reactive capacity in the context of Ukraine. We have this anti-coercion instrument. If the political will is there, the tools enable you to act very quickly. Where I would agree very much with Elvire is that there is more than just competitiveness. You need to have the capacity of massive resource mobilization in today's environment. And that is what China is doing, and what the US is doing. And that will require more from the European level, both in terms of financing for defense, but also in financing digital or tech sovereignty, in financing clean tech and the clean industrial ambitions. And this will require more, I think, from EU budgets. And there, I think we have a tendency of being slow in Europe. We found solutions during COVID. The RRF is far from perfect, but I think this whole debate that is shaping up on the MFF, and they are actually finding tools and ways of acting outside the MFF and before the MFF, will be absolutely critical. But there too, I prefer seeing the silver lining. Look to Denmark, and this is pre-Greenland. This is pre what the discussions had on Greenland. Mette Frederiksen was out in the public debate before Christmas, months ago, saying there are no taboos anymore. Denmark has been amongst the frugals, and she's been very careful about preparing her country over the past months now, saying there are no taboos anymore. We have to be able to act differently. So that is one element of an answer. And then maybe a short comment on what Peter said. Yes, there are trade-offs, massive trade-offs between competitiveness and green agenda, etc. I don't agree that the solution there is to let go of the CBAM. I think the CBAM probably needs to be revised and adjusted, but what you need to actually close are sort of the circumvention possibilities of CBAM. But also there's the whole debate about WTO, which you raise. I don't actually think a WTO is an issue for Europeans. What do I mean by that? When I say WTO is not an issue, I don't think Europeans will want to throw WTO on the bus. They will not want to damage it, but there are ways around it. So if I were to sit down for negotiation with the Americans on economic security and doing deals on steel, aluminum, or semicon, or raw materials, or some clean tech, or whatever it might be, and the American side is saying, well, listen, guys, we live in this different world that you described, Peter. Where on the one hand, we are your allies and we're not behaving very friendly right now, true. But there's the question of China, which is an even deeper and longer term and graver issue, and the issue of Russia. why can't you act together with us on China? And the new administration will demand much more robust answers. Well, I do think if there are economic security deals to be found, there are ways for Europe to also to up its game towards China and trying to do this in a WTO compatible manner. So what US does through 232, immediately raising the tariffs, while Europeans can solve through a 3-month or 2 months or 6 months investigation and put in place countervailing duties. So it's not the same means, but the result can be go towards the same and be similar, because what we do know is China is in massive breach, is massively in the red box on all across all its industries, or these critical industries. So there is a scope for Europe to act if it wants, finding the legal avenues to do that, preserving sort of its WTO stance, I would believe.
Just for the record, I'm a huge fan of.
Peter, I give it to you in a sec. I just wanted to mention this was also an answer to Mara Lee's question, who mentioned a question on 232 tariffs, and thank you for responding to that. And Peter, now you have the full
Just
floor.
Just for the record, I'm a huge fan of the CBAM, and all I was saying, and maybe you're right that it can be finessed and you can maintain fidelity to WTO rules and go through the CBAM, which of course would be the best of all worlds. But if you can't, I just think I pointed out as a decision point where it strikes me that choosing WTO rules over saving the climate is a bit illogical. And then since you mentioned the 232 tariffs, they will, interestingly enough, the truths that Biden engineered on the steel and aluminum tariffs expires right about when the America First Trade Policy Review is going to be released. And it strikes me that not, I wouldn't want to bet a lot of money on it, but some Republicans in Congress are pushing for a granted, not WTO consistent version of a CBAM. And granted, it's mostly about China, but nonetheless, it seems to me, if I were sitting in Brussels and nobody's asking me, but I would be thinking about how can I approach the Trump administration and say, look, we know, you may not think of climate as a #1 issue, but we share some of the same issues about China and its subsidized manufacturing and how that's affecting our competitiveness. And instead of putting the tariffs on, let's try to see if we can't find some way to align the Republican bills on border taxes and what we are doing. I just think that there is an opportunity for engagement there because of this interesting kind of double deadline.
100%, yeah.
Can I, Peter, put to you a question by our own Ian Hernandez, who is writing in the chat function, Trump's trade in a circle has two camps. Trade representatives Jameson Greer sees tariffs as an end in themselves. Trades are Peter Navarro, who shares this view, especially on China. However, Commerce Secretary Lutnick and Wall Street Voice see tariffs more as bargaining chips. Meanwhile, Congress holds constitutional authority over tariffs, but Trump could bypass it using IEEPA. How will these competing views shape US trade policy, and can Congress assert control, or will executive actions dominate? Well, I'm having a steep learning curve clearly here as well. Peter, can you come in on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. That's an interesting question because I would say never underestimate, unless the world is completely changed, never underestimate the what's the word I would use? At least the desire of Congress or to remind the political process about its constitutionally mandated powers on trade and commerce. It happened during the Biden administration when the U.S. wanted to do a deal on critical minerals with the European Union. And I think that maybe on the Democratic side, it was bipartisan, by the way, under the Biden administration with this issue. Maybe on the Republican side, maybe both. I do think that you'll hear some voices from Congress about their role. And so that will be a kind of complicating or moderating factor. I agree that it's not clear yet what the Trump administration thinks the purpose of tariffs is. I think that to a certain degree, Trump maybe likes that. He likes to have this sort of, different voices, and that maybe gives him a little bit more room to assert his own authority. But, I go back to what I said. Trump believes that trade deficits are bad and that tariffs are a way to remedy them. I think that I don't see any member of the administration diverging in a sort of 300 180-degree way from that particular belief. I think the key question is how much of Trump's deal-making instincts will come into play. In other words, will the tariffs be used as leverage to get some kind of deal? In which because Trump, there's two things about Trump. He believes trade deficits are bad and tariffs can fix them, but he also likes deals. So to me, since he is so dominant, it's which one of those is going to end up, having more weight.
Thanks very much, Peter, for picking that one up. I was wondering, Francis, did you want to come in on that? And then Elvire, be assured the next / last one will be for you. Fun.
So I agree with Peter about Congress and its desire to protect its prerogatives. And we've seen that since the beginning of this administration, both in terms of the confirmation process. So you will remember that Trump initially said he wanted to appoint a lot of recess appointments and not go through the confirmation process. That did not happen. And we have seen it in a few other cases. However, what we've also seen is that while Congress wants to protect the procedures, the Republicans in the confirmation process, some of them have objected to some of the appointees, but when it comes to voting for them, they vote for them. So in the end, Trump has a great deal of control over the Republicans. And so far, we've seen that they've not rejected really anything that he's asked for. There is a draft bill by two Democrats, I think Senator Kaine and Senator Coons, that would restrict the ability of the president to impose tariffs without congressional oversight, without congressional permission. We'll see whether that goes anywhere. I'm skeptical, but that will be a test. So I think, this one of the issues that we're facing right now is Trump's control over the Republican Party has, if anything, grown since the election and continues to grow after the inauguration. So it's much more now, almost like a parliamentary system where the government in power has to observe certain procedural rules in dealing with Parliament, but they get what they want. So
thank you very
much. I would
Fran,
also just say on Peter's comments about tariffs. Trump likes tariffs and their leverage, not only because of the trade deficit, but he's found it very useful in all these other situations. The Colombia situation was not about a trade deficit. So it becomes just, instead of a démarche, I threatened to put tariffs on it. So, it's linkages that are not always rational to the others that the United States is dealing with.
Favorite instrument. Thank you very much, Fran. I bring this back to Elvire, who has an obligation that will follow shortly, and I would like to thank you already for making the time to being with us, Elvire. You have the chance for a final set of comments, but perhaps you also would like to pick up a question by Samsul Hakanan, who says, with the EU shifting towards a more independent Eurocentric policy, what key factors should we consider regarding Europe's role in the global geopolitical landscape, specifically with regard to South Asia? Elvire, this or what you felt was important for you to wrap this up for you before you have to leave us?
Well, if you allow me, I just want to go back to the final comments of Fran. We cannot but wish that the Congress will have a sort of rebalancing role, but we know that that Trump may be, he may be able to use the IEEPA, which will speed any implementation of tariffs. And as you just said, it could target some very horizontally some other issues and the EU regulations. And I want to go back to an initial comment that you made, saying that the EU is quite different in 2025 compared to 2016. sorry, 2016, that is very real. And I think we have also to pay attention to the new tools that the EU has, that recently the EU has adopted. I'm not so sure this is so well known, or at least assessed in Washington, because most of them we haven't been using them. But if we talk about the foreign subsidy regulation, the reciprocity in public procurement, and the anti-coercion instrument, they are still on shelves, but we have them. And the whole question is, when are we going to start really using them, and how we can amplify the effect in the way we sequence the use of those instruments. And of course, anti-coercion instrument was calibrated as a deterrence instrument, but we have to prove that it's biting as well. So the EU could be well pressure to use these tools if we're talking about threatening the implementation of EU regulation. So this is something that we will have to follow, and this is something on which we would need to work, which is the political backup that the member states will have to give to the European Commission in using those instruments. And I think it's something that should be already mentioned in the European debate, to build up this unity of the 27, and just to increase that deterrence dimension. Just going back to the question about Southeast Asia, if we listen to Ursula von der Leyen's on trade policy and the relaunch of some new negotiations, the focus is pretty much on Southeast Asia, and we know that we still have a lot to do with ASEAN member states. We already have some FTAs with some of those countries, not only Vietnam, but we still have a lot of room of maneuver, and need to increase not only engaging with those countries and in South Asia, but also engaging more broadly with the so-called global South. Trump will leave a lot of free space in the global South, because there's going to be a lot of very strong backlash. We can see that with Colombia, but the signal that has been given with Colombia has a huge echo already, and so there is a space that the EU should occupy, and not let only China occupy that space, because the whole strategy of China at the moment is precisely to diversify its exports in the global South, supply them with all the green technologies, and this is something that the EU should have high in its agenda. And thank you very much. I'm very sorry to leave now.
Merci beaucoup, Elvire. Thank you so much. And I will use your responses now as a bridge as we are wrapping up this session, and ask each and every one of the three colleagues who are still with us to say, in terms of opportunity, what is it that we're overlooking? If you had sort of 30 seconds to make a pitch for Europeans to seize opportunity in this antagonistic environment, where would you direct us?
I want to jump right on what Elvire said, that last comment about the EU in the global South. I think that's a terrific insight, because I think what the EU can do is not only advance its own interests, but because some of those overlap with authentic US interests, it can also, by doing that, advance what is good for the United States. Whoever the administration is, and however that administration perceives its interests, they may not always perceive them correctly. But I think that's something where the EU can, and for example, what you said about passing the Mercosur trade agreement, another thing that is in, I think, the authentic US interests, no matter how a particular administration says, sees them. So I think that anything that helps the EU to become a stronger global economic player is not only good for itself, but I think would also be good for the United States.
Great, thanks a lot, Peter. I'll bring this to Georg then.
Well, it's very difficult to disagree with that. I mean, I think
you can come up with another area where you.
Yeah, I was going to say the opportunity, like Elvire and Peter, is the rest of the world, and I think we have been too inward looking, we have been lazy, and it's a paradox, many perhaps, that when the world gets more unruly, there's also an opportunity for Europeans to up their game in that respect. We talked about the opportunities or the need for not talking the EU down. I think that's also an opportunity to start talking positively in crisis. And look, we are here representing something different, and this we have to believe in. And I think a lot of European citizens are waiting for that, for leaders to have that discourse and to be able to show that we represent, that Europeans represent something else than the chaos around us. I would say that one needs to be realistic about this, and I think one of the fundamental conditions and tests that we haven't really talked about now is Ukraine. I saw there was a question from Penelope on that, and I think one of the critical tests of Europe's agency is to be able to say we have Ukraine's back and figure out how to do that. So this we should not forget. And the final point I wanted to mention, which I found was really interesting, was, and I picked up from von der Leyen's speech in Davos, was how she was discussing China. A year ago, von der Leyen was the big China hawk. Her speech at the EPC, the de-risking speech, she was very frank in some of the words she used to characterize China's role in the international system. And suddenly now in Davos, she spoke about China before the US, and it was much softer. And I don't think this is actually about von der Leyen going soft on China or on overcapacity, on weaponized dependencies, or on China's support to Russia. I think this is about Europeans, here in the person of von der Leyen, entering the geopolitical chessboard, understanding what we need to play also as Europeans with some of these actors. And I think that is also part of what we have to do and had to have the capacity to do going forward. And it's not going to be easy, but that is what we have to try.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Georg. Final concluding opportunity from Francis Burwell.
I agree what has been said about reaching out to others. I would point especially to Japan, Korea, Canada, and Mexico, all of whom are going to find themselves on the brunt of Trump administration policy. The Commission, I believe, is going to India later this spring, and I'm very interested to see what comes out of that discussion. In terms of opportunities with the United States, I wanted to respond to the question about mechanisms. I think the TTC is dead, unfortunately. I was a big fan, but I don't see this administration investing in that. But there were dialogues that did continue during the first Trump administration. The energy dialogue, the China dialogue, and the cybersecurity dialogue are the three I would point to in particular. These were less formal. They didn't have all sorts of working groups underneath them, but they were good areas for keeping conversations going on areas where there were some congruence of interests. For example, the energy dialogue could be a very good place to talk about continued shipments of LNG and the pending methane regulations on both sides of the Atlantic that could challenge the shipment of LNG. So I think that there are some things that can be talked about, and there are mechanisms, but it's going to be much more ad hoc, much less formal, and it's going to depend on Europe first defining its own interests before it engages.
Lynn, thank you very much, Fran. And this brings us to the end of a very, very dense conversation. And I thank you all, especially our speakers. I think, Peter, I can say that on both our behalves, on behalf of the EPC and AGI. Thank you for joining, and thank you to all of you who were coming, attending, putting great questions. This is a workbench that we will continue to work on together and chew on whatever comes in the coming weeks and months ahead. I was just reminded of a little piece that I scribbled earlier today, and that exactly looked at the question of, what does it take for Europe to understand there is still opportunity out there? Something tells me that it is also about mindset. And I think it was Fran who said in the beginning that Europe was so used to a great deal of attention. And that doesn't only relate to the United States. I think that relates to the rest of the world. And European elites have been pretty spoiled with that, and a benign environment to flourish in. And I think this mental rewiring that needs to happen is what I argue is paramount. It hasn't arrived even at the top of those organizations that should actually be leading now the camp of those finding opportunity. Not to say this is the end to transatlantic ties, but the world is a bigger place. So I would like to thank you again all, wish you a good day, a good afternoon and conclusion to the week. And thank you very much for joining this joint EPC AGI event.